I am pleased to announce our new Director of Operations, Lawrence Sinclair said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who had never had to search a warehouse floor at midnight for a missing shipment. He smiled toward the far end of the conference table, gesturing toward the young man sitting there. Brad Sinclair will be stepping into the role effective immediately. For a second, I honestly thought I had heard him wrong. The room seemed to grow cold, and the hum of the air conditioner felt suddenly loud in the silence that followed. Brad was 28 years old. He had been with Nexus Medical Supply for less than 18 months, having joined us as a junior analyst. He had never worked in medical distribution before coming here, and more importantly, he was Lawrence's nephew. I had been with Nexus Medical Supply for 10 years. For the last 18 months, I had already been doing most of the Director of Operations work. My name is Claire Vance. I was 42 years old, the Senior Operations Manager, and the person everyone called when a shipment failed. A hospital network was at risk of running out of critical inventory. A supplier froze an order, or a logistics problem threatened to become an executive disaster. That Monday morning, I had walked into the leadership meeting believing Lawrence was finally going to make my title match the job I was already doing. Instead, he gave it to family. If you have ever been passed over after years of loyalty, you know the physical sensation of that moment. It is a sudden sharp ache in the chest, followed by a strange numbness. Lawrence turned his gaze toward me. His smile remains pleasant. Claire, Brad will need someone experienced underneath him to guide him through the transition. Think of this as your chance to show him how everything really works on the ground level. No one in the room moved. Our finance manager looked down at her notebook, suddenly fascinated by her notes. The warehouse director stopped tapping his pen against the table. Even Brad shifted in his chair, looking down as if he knew the sentence had landed badly. I kept my face completely still. Is the decision final? I asked, keeping my voice level and calm. Lawrence gave me the kind of patronizing smile executives use when they want to make disrespect sound reasonable. Yes, and I do not want you making this emotional. Brad brings the executive presence we need at the next level. Executive presence? I had spent 10 years handling the operational disasters that kept his executive meetings quiet. Brad had spent 18 months sitting in those same meetings, summarizing the reports I wrote. I nodded once. Understood, I said. That was my first surprise for them. I did not beg. I did not remind Lawrence about our promotion conversations over the past year. I did not mention the 80-hour work weeks, the midnight emergency calls, or the fact that I had been running the entire department since our previous director retired. I simply opened my notebook and prepared to take notes. Brad relaxed almost immediately, leaning forward with a sudden burst of enthusiasm. Great, he said. Then I will need a full transition package by Friday. I need hospital accounts, key suppliers, carrier contacts, escalation procedures, inventory exceptions, emergency routing, basically everything you do, basically everything I do. He said it like my entire career could fit into a 3-ring binder. I looked at him and said, I will organize the existing documentation. He smiled, and Lawrence smiled too. They thought I had accepted the new order. What they did not understand was that Nexus's operations were not held together by a list of phone numbers and process maps. The documents covered normal business days. My real value showed up on abnormal ones. When a hospital needed a critical surgical component after the shipping cutoff time, I knew which warehouse manager would authorize a late pull. When a carrier had no truck capacity, I knew which regional contact could find a vehicle without turning the shipment into a pricing disaster. When a supplier placed our account on hold, I knew the history behind the dispute and who had the authority to release the order. None of that was secret, but it was not something you could write down in a transition binder. It was experience, judgment, and trust earned over a decade of showing up. And the company had repeatedly decided that building proper backup coverage was too expensive. The meeting continued, but I barely heard the next 10 minutes. Brad asked basic questions about dashboards and reporting lines. Lawrence talked about fresh leadership and strategic vision. Then a new organizational chart appeared on the projector screen. Director of Operations, Brad Sinclair. Underneath him was my name, Senior Operations Manager, Claire Vance. 10 years of work reduced to one box below a man I was now expected to train. I closed my notebook when the meeting ended. Brad stopped me before I reached the door. "Claire, seriously, do not overthink the binder," he said. "I just need the important things." I looked at him, feeling a sudden wave of clarity. The important things. That was the moment I realized how little they understood. They thought they had replaced me. What they had actually done was put an inexperienced man in charge of a complex machine he did not know existed. I had not joined Nexus expecting to spend 10 years here, but I had stayed because I cared. Now that care was gone. 10 years earlier, I came to Nexus Medical Supply as a junior inventory coordinator. Back then, the company was small. We served 3 regional hospital networks, our warehouse systems were inconsistent, and half our emergency procedures existed only in someone's memory. My plan was simple: learn the business, earn a promotion or two, and keep moving to larger healthcare logistics companies. Instead, Nexus kept growing, expanding its distribution footprint across 15 states and serving hundreds of healthcare facilities. And every time the company grew, my job grew faster than my title. I learned purchasing, warehouse scheduling, supplier escalation, regulatory compliance, and cold chain transportation logistics. Before long, I was being pulled into complex operational problems that technically belonged to 4 different departments. I became useful because I hated letting problems sit unresolved, and I had a natural knack for finding order in chaotic environments. That trait helped my career rise, but it also trapped me in a cycle of endless firefighting. When a distribution center called at midnight because a critical medical equipment order had been loaded against the wrong account, I answered. When a carrier missed a critical pickup before a holiday weekend, I stayed online until we found another route. When our warehouse software failed during a major expansion, I helped create a temporary manual control process, so thousands of orders did not disappear into a massive backlog. No one forced me to care that much. I cared about the work, my warehouse team, and the hospital customers depending on equipment arriving when we promised. When a shipment failed, it was not just a metric on a dashboard. It was a surgeon waiting for tools or a patient waiting for a pacemaker. So, when something broke, I took it personally. For years, leadership praised that dedication. "Claire always finds a way," they would say in executive meetings. "Give the problem to Claire. Call Claire before this reaches the client." At first, I heard those words as recognition. Later, I understood they were also a warning. Every compliment came with another uncompensated responsibility. Nexus opened 2 additional distribution facilities, and I helped coordinate the entire operating transition. I trained new managers, built escalation routines, and joined supplier contract reviews that were supposed to be far above my pay grade. My title changed a few times, but my actual authority never caught up with my workload. There was also a deeply personal reason I stayed. A few years into my time there, my mother went through a severe financial setback after her small family grocery business failed due to a large national retailer opening nearby. She was left with significant lease debts and personal obligations. I helped her with expenses and medical bills while keeping my own finances stable. Stability mattered to me, and I could not simply walk away every time work became unfair. Lawrence Sinclair understood that vulnerability perfectly. He was master at giving me just enough praise and hoped to keep me invested in the company's future. Whenever a competitor recruiter called, I heard some version of the same empty promise from Lawrence. "Stay with us, Claire. You are building something here. Your time is coming." The biggest promise came 18 months before Brad's promotion. Our previous operations director retired after 20 years of service. I expected the company to post the role immediately and run a formal hiring process. Instead, Lawrence called me into his office for a private conversation. "We are still deciding what the structure should look like," he said. "For now, I need you to absorb most of the director responsibilities, temporarily." I asked him if we were adjusting my title and compensation to reflect the new duties. He leaned back in his leather chair and smiled. "Let us not get ahead of the process. Show us you can own it first, then we will make it permanent at the next budget review." I should have recognized what that meant, but after 8 years, I thought I had reached the final test of my loyalty. So, I said yes. Temporary became 18 months. I ran leadership calls when Lawrence was unavailable. I reviewed supplier performance, trained warehouse managers, prepared executive summaries, and handled major hospital escalations before they reached senior leadership. Every few months, I asked about the director role. Every time, Lawrence had another reason to wait. Budget cycles, reorganization, board timing, or compensation reviews. I kept believing the next conversation would be different. That was my weakness. I believed excellent work eventually became impossible to ignore. But excellent work can be ignored for a very long time when the person benefiting from it has no reason to change the arrangement. By the time Brad arrived, I had built a reputation as the single point of rescue. I had warned Lawrence about this vulnerability more than once, explaining that having one person hold all the operational knowledge was a major business risk. But leadership liked the immediate results more than they cared about long-term risk. As long as problems disappeared before reaching the executive floor, the system looked healthy. That was the part Brad could not see from an organizational chart. He thought he had inherited a simple department. What he had really inherited was 10 years of custom decisions, relationships, exceptions, and warnings. And within his very first week as director, he was about to start cutting blindly into all of it, completely unaware of the consequences. What Brad saw when he looked at our department was a set of dashboards: orders shipped, inventory on hand, carrier performance, supplier fill rates, and escalation counts. What I saw was everything those dashboards could not explain. Nexus looked organized from the executive floor because people like me spent years keeping the chaos from ever reaching it. On Thursday afternoon, Brad sent a calendar invitation to the operations leadership team. The subject line was 90-day efficiency reset. At the bottom of the invitation, one sentence caught my attention. "We will begin by eliminating legacy workarounds and unnecessary backup processes." I read it twice, then I leaned back in my chair. Brad thought he was about to clean up my department. What he was actually about to do was remove the protections that had kept its problems invisible. The next day, I went home, opened a folder I had not touched in months, and spread the contents across my kitchen table. My employment agreement, performance reviews, old recruiter messages, and emails from Lawrence telling me my promotion was coming. At the top of the recruiter messages was one name I had ignored 3 times: Diana Cobb. I picked up my phone and dialed her number. The first thing I did after calling Diana was nothing dramatic. I did not resign the next morning. I did not send an angry email. I did not tell anyone at Nexus that I was looking. I sat at my kitchen table and read every document that could matter: my employment agreement, the employee handbook, my confidentiality obligations, the bonus policy, my unused vacation balance, and the section covering resignation notice. I wanted to know exactly where I stood before I made a move. There was no non-compete clause preventing me from joining another medical distributor. I still had strict confidentiality obligations, and I intended to honor every one of them. That mattered to me. I wanted to leave cleanly, not because Lawrence deserved consideration, but because my reputation did. Diana answered on the second ring. "Claire Vance," she said. "I was starting to think you had blocked my number." I laughed for the first time that day. "I almost did," I replied. Then I told her I was ready to talk. She had contacted me 3 times over the previous 8 months about Vanguard Clinical Distribution, a fast-growing competitor that had been expanding its hospital network. I had ignored every message because Lawrence kept telling me my promotion was close. 2 days later, I was on a video call with Vanguard's Chief Operating Officer, Valerie Cole. That conversation felt different from anything I had experienced at Nexus in years. Valerie did not ask me standard questions about my salary history or how many people reported directly to me. She asked how I handled operational risk during rapid growth. She asked what usually broke first when distribution volume increased faster than management systems. She asked how I built supplier accountability without damaging relationships. And then she asked, if you had real authority to design the operation correctly, what would you change first? I actually paused. No executive at Nexus had asked me that question in a long time. I answered carefully. I spoke about my experience, my management approach, and the systems I believed strong operations needed. I did not disclose Nexus pricing, contracts, customer data, or confidential supplier terms. There was no need for that. My value was not a stolen spreadsheet. It was knowing what questions to ask before the spreadsheet turned red. 3 business days later, Diana called again. Vanguard wanted to offer me the position of Director of Operational Strategy. The base compensation was significantly higher than my Nexus salary, and the annual bonus structure was far better. More important, the role came with actual authority to build cross-training, supplier risk controls, and backup ownership before emergencies happened. I read the offer twice, then I signed it. But before I resigned, I finished something else. I cleaned up every transition document Brad had requested. I organized the existing operating procedures. I updated the risk register. I listed supplier issues still waiting on decisions. I documented carrier renewals. I identified accounts that needed extra attention over the next 30 days. I wanted to make sure that the transition files were spotless, structured, and completely self-explanatory. I created detailed index sheets, labeled every directory clearly, and left clear step-by-step guides for the standard daily tasks. Nothing was hidden, nothing was deleted. Nothing belonged only to me when I walked out. But I also stopped doing one thing Nexus had quietly depended on for years. I stopped making decisions for other people without making them own those decisions. When Brad messaged, "Can you just tell me what we should do here?" I replied, "I can give you the options. Please confirm in writing which one you want approved." When he asked me to draft a recommendation he could send to Lawrence, I sent the recommendation with his approval line clearly documented. He noticed the change immediately. "You are being very formal lately," he said during a brief exchange in the hallway. "I am making the transition clear," I replied. He did not like that answer. By then, I did not care about his approval. I was focusing entirely on my exciting new career chapter at Vanguard, happily leaving behind the years of unfulfilled promises, unequal workloads, and corporate disrespect that had characterized my time at Nexus. Once the Vanguard paperwork was complete, I scheduled a meeting with Human Resources. Lawrence joined unexpectedly. I placed my resignation letter on the table. "My final day will be exactly 2 weeks from Friday," I said, maintaining a polite and even tone of voice. Lawrence stared at me. "2 weeks? Yes, that is impossible. Brad planned on 6. I looked at the Human Resources manager. "Our policy requires 2 weeks for my position, correct?" The manager hesitated, then nodded. Lawrence's face tightened. "Claire, after everything this company has done for you, you are really going to leave us like this?" That sentence almost impressed me. I had spent 10 years giving Nexus more than my job description required. Now they were offended because I planned to give exactly what the policy required. "I am completing the transition professionally," I said. "But I have accepted another opportunity." Brad had 6 weeks in his head, but Nexus had just discovered that he actually had only 10 business days of transition remaining. For most of those 10 days, Lawrence acted like my resignation was temporary. He stopped by my office twice with comments like, "You still have time to think this through." Brad took the opposite approach. He acted as if he had already mastered the job. In transition meetings, I would explain why a certain hospital account needed a specific escalation path, and Brad would interrupt halfway through. "I have got it," he would say. When I walked through emergency freight procedures, he checked his phone. When I explained that one supplier had a history of sudden capacity cuts at quarter end, he said, That sounds like relationship management, not operations." I wrote everything down anyway, compiling detailed reports on dates, operational risks, open decisions, and critical supplier renewal deadlines. My goal was simple. When I left, no one would be able to claim I had taken the operation hostage. The information would be there. Whether Brad respected, it was his choice. On my final Friday, my team brought a small cake into the break room. One of my warehouse coordinators hugged me and whispered, "Half of us are updating our resumes." I pulled back. "Do what is right for your career. Do not make a decision because I am leaving." "I am not," she said. "I am making it because he is staying." I understood, but I did not recruit anyone. I did not tell people to quit. I had spent too long protecting that team to turn them into pieces in a game of revenge. At 5 in the afternoon, I turned in my laptop, phone, and badge. The human resources manager checked each item off a list. Then she said, "Good luck, Claire." "Thank you," I replied. I walked out carrying one small handbag and the framed family photo that had sat on my desk for a decade. At 5:13, the first serious problem hit. I did not know that until later. A refrigeration control component needed by one of Nexus's largest hospital networks was delayed after the primary carrier ran out of capacity. Under our normal exception process, that should have triggered 3 steps. Check alternate inventory, call the backup supplier contact, and secure emergency freight before the regional cutoff. Brad saw one thing. The shipment had missed its primary pickup, so he called our preferred backup carrier. That was when he learned the emergency pricing agreement had expired. I had flagged that renewal 3 times. Once in the risk register, once in a transition email, and once during a meeting Brad cut short because he had another executive call. He had delayed the renewal because he believed the rate was too high and wanted to renegotiate. Now the carrier would still move the freight, but not under the old emergency terms and not fast enough to meet the hospital timeline without executive approval on the new cost. Brad waited, entirely unsure of how to proceed, and actively refusing to make a decision that would show up on his first quarter operational cost reports. By Saturday morning, 2 hospital orders were at risk of late delivery, which carried major service-level agreement penalties. Then another problem surfaced. A supplier placed Nexus on temporary credit review after Brad challenged a group of disputed fees. On paper, challenging them looked reasonable. What he did not understand was that those fees were tied to a previous settlement arrangement, involving expedited production and credit scheduled across multiple invoices. That history was in the supplier notes. He had skimmed them. By Sunday evening, warehouse managers were sending emails asking who had authority to approve substitutions for backordered cardiac monitors. By Monday morning, 3 issues had become 7. Missed pickups, inventory mismatches, 2 unresolved substitutions, a supplier hold, a freight approval delay, and hospital purchasing managers asking why no one could give them a firm recovery plan. Nothing had crashed because I left. No secret system stopped working. The operation was failing because experienced judgment had been replaced by confidence without context. At 8:12 Monday morning, Lawrence walked into an executive meeting expecting a normal weekly update. Instead, he got a list of open escalations that would normally have been solved before he ever saw them. The warehouse managers were in a panic, and the customer service teams had no answers. For 10 years, I had kept those critical operational problems below the waterline, handling them quietly through direct relationships and personal trust. Now, every single one of them was sitting squarely in front of him on the conference table. At Vanguard, I was in orientation when my personal phone vibrated inside my bag. I ignored it. A few minutes later, it buzzed again. During a break, I finally looked. 3 missed calls from Lawrence. I put the phone face down. The 4th call went to voicemail. I waited until lunch to listen. Lawrence's voice was different. No polished executive tone, just urgency. "Claire, call me as soon as you get this. We are having some transition issues. We need your help." I did not call Lawrence back during lunch. I finished my orientation session, met 2 members of my new team, and reviewed Vanguard's supplier risk dashboard. Then, at 4:30, when my first day was officially over, I returned his call. Lawrence answered before the second ring. "Claire, thank God. What is going on?" I asked. "We are dealing with some transition complications," he said. "Brad is still getting familiar with a few accounts." I stayed quiet for a moment. "Lawrence, I work for Vanguard now." "I know," he replied. "I am not asking you to come back. Just help us bridge the gap." "I can't provide informal support to Nexus," I said. Lawrence's tone changed. "Claire, these are hospital accounts you managed for years." I said. "I also left complete transition documentation." The next morning, Nexus Human Resources emailed me. This time, the request was formal. Nexus wanted to discuss a temporary consulting agreement. I forwarded the message to Valerie Cole. She read it and asked, "Do you want to help them?" "Only if it protects the customers, not Brad," I replied. She nodded, and we defined the boundaries. Before we could respond, Lawrence called again and offered a consulting rate more than triple my old hourly equivalent. I still did not agree immediately. Then Nexus's chief executive officer, Audrey Bennett, contacted me directly. She asked for a 30-minute video meeting, which Valerie approved. When I joined the call, Audrey was there with Lawrence, Brad, Human Resources, and Nexus's legal counsel. The mood was tense. Audrey spoke first. We have a service risk situation with one of our largest hospital networks. She explained that the network had placed new orders on hold until Nexus delivered a formal recovery plan. Two suppliers wanted clearer escalation ownership. Warehouse managers had started bypassing Brad because approvals were taking too long, and several senior operations employees had independently applied for jobs elsewhere. Then Brad made his mistake. He leaned toward the camera. "The bigger issue is that Claire's transition was not complete," he said. Audrey looked at him, then at me. "What specifically was missing?" I opened the folder on my computer. "I can answer that." I shared the transition acknowledgement Brad had signed. It listed every major operating document I provided: supplier notes, hospital escalations procedures, open renewal dates, carrier agreements, the risk register, outstanding account issues, and training sessions. Then I showed the calendar record. 3 sessions had been shortened and 2 had been canceled, all by Brad. One of the canceled meetings was specifically titled Emergency Freight and Backup Carrier Process. No one spoke for several seconds. Brad finally stammered, "I was prioritizing strategic responsibilities." Audrey looked at him coldly. "The expired carrier agreement was covered in that meeting?" "Yes," I said. "It was also flagged in 3 written documents." Lawrence rubbed his forehead. That was the moment I knew blaming me was over. The paper trail was too clean. Audrey turned toward me. "What would it take for you to come back?" Lawrence jumped in quickly. "We can fix the title issue. Director of Operations, immediate adjustment, significant salary increase, retention bonus. Brad can report elsewhere." 6 months earlier, that offer would have changed my life. Now it meant almost nothing. I looked at Lawrence. The position stopped being attractive when I learned what it took for Nexus to value me. "You did not need more evidence of what I could do. You already had 10 years of it. You only changed your mind when losing me became expensive." During the recovery discussions, their legal representative tried to claim my exception logs were proprietary, but my attorney had already advised me that under 17 U.S.C. Section 106, general administrative notes and personal relationship contacts did not constitute copyrighted work. In fact, their attempt to coerce me into training Brad Sinclair under threat of withholding my accrued compensation was void ab initio, and Lawrence Sinclair's threats of suing me for breach of fiduciary duty were baseless, since I was a non-exempt employee with no executive status. Furthermore, Lawrence Sinclair's decision to waste corporate resources on a family member who neglected critical carrier agreements constituted a dissipation of assets that the board would inevitably investigate. They backed down immediately. Audrey Bennett simply asked, "Would you consider short-term consulting?" I agreed under strict conditions. Everything would be formal. Vanguard would approve the outside work. My role would be limited to explaining existing processes, and I would not return permanently. They accepted. During the recovery meeting 2 days later, representatives from the hospital network joined. Brad tried to lead, but every serious operational question came toward me. I answered only what the consulting allowed. I did not attack Brad. His own lack of knowledge was visible. Within a week, Audrey removed him from operational leadership. Lawrence faced board questions about the nepotism and rejected succession plans, and he left Nexus shortly after. Brad moved to a smaller role before leaving too. At Vanguard, Valerie Cole gave me exactly what Nexus never had: authority that matched responsibility. We built rotating escalation ownership, documented supplier risk history, and ran failure drills. I made one rule clear: nobody on my team would become another version of me. We created a system where leadership made people stronger instead of making one person exhausted.